All right, can I have your guys' attention for a second? All right, so has anyone in here used the router or router table before? What do you use it for?
I use it for my box.
Your box? All right, so the router is a very versatile tool. We can do all sorts of different things on it. But what you guys are going to use it for is you're going to use it to take a board and round over the edges on your project, okay? So depending on what you want to do, you can give different profiles to your project. So you can have like all sorts of little fancy curves. Or I can use like things like this, like straight bits, and I can cut in grooves, like dado grooves or rabbit grooves. But if you know how to use this, it can do all sorts of cool things, okay? So with the router table, what kind of safety stuff and gear do I need to use this, do you think? Glasses. Pretty much you always need glasses when you're working with power tools. Not headphones. Earmuffs or earplugs, okay? Because this machine is quite loud and it gives kind of like a very high-pitched sound, and sometimes you might be here for a while, so you don't want to expose your ears to harsh sounds for long periods of time, so you should have hearing protection when using the... Well, I'm only going to be doing a quick demo, so I'm only going to be doing like one quick cut, so you guys will be fine. But for prolonged use, you're going to definitely want to make sure you have your thing good to go. Okay, so with the router table, changing bits on it, because these bits come in different shapes and sizes. What do you notice about these two bits? They're big and small, okay? So they either come in 1/2 inch sizes or 1/4 inch sizes. So depending if you're doing really heavy duty stuff that requires a lot of work on it, you're probably gonna use one with a 1/2 inch bit, okay? But if you're doing light duty or less work, a 1/4 inch bit will be fine, because if I was to use this for a very long time with a 1/4 inch bit, it could potentially snap, okay? Now, routers spin at very, very high speeds, like in the thousands of RPM. Do you guys know what RPM stands for? Anybody know what RPM stands for? Rotations per minute. So let's just say if this goes 1,000 RPM, this would be spinning 1,000 times in 1 minute, okay? Given that, that is a lot, but it probably spins even faster than that. Now, given that speed, any guesses what would happen if your finger was to touch this?
Gone.
Gone, literally. So when you see me use this, this is what happens to the wood. That's what's gonna happen to your finger if it touches this. So you need to make sure you keep your fingers clear away from this bit, because if it touches it, it's not like a saw where if you cut off your finger, you might be able to reattach it. If you touch this, there's nothing left. So it can be scary. So making sure you know what you're doing, keeping your hands away is very important. Okay. Now, with this, being able to change bits is important. So when you're changing bits, you need to, one, make sure the power's off, or if the power's running, you need to make sure you unplug the tool, okay? Because if the shop's running and everyone else is using power tools, you don't want to be right here where the bit is and for some reason have the tool accidentally turn on while your hand's in it, because we could lose a finger or something. So make sure that if you're ever making adjustments on this, at least you guys in grade 9, I'll probably do all the adjustments on this, but in like a senior class, I get senior students to do more adjustments on machines. So if you have to, just make sure you're careful with that. Okay, Russell, put that down, please. All right, so when you're making adjustments, this is a pretty fancy router table. So with it, what I want to do is this piece here, I need to turn it counterclockwise so it's unlocked. And then I can put this Allen key in here and I can turn this up a bit. I want to crank this up high enough to where I can access the nuts to loosen this, okay? So, do you guys remember with the drill press, the piece that holds the drill bit, what's that called? The chuck. Now, similar to the drill press, there's a piece that holds the bit for the router, but it's not called a chuck, okay? This piece here is called a collet, okay? So for example, here's what it looks like. So this is actually an adapter for this 1/2 inch size, but currently I have the 1/4 inch size in here. So if I wanted to switch to this bigger one, I'd have to replace it with this. Okay. So to take the bits out, you're gonna need these 2 wrenches. Okay. So in this drawer down here, I usually have the tools and some bits. So the wrenches for this one go in here, and under this one, the wrenches are a little bit different for this one. So make sure you use the right ones. Okay. And then we can loosen this guy off of here. Like that. So now this comes out. So whenever you're changing router bits, the one thing you need to keep in mind is that at least 15 millimeters of this has to go inside the collar, okay? Because if I only grab it by a little bit, if this thing's spinning at like 2,000 RPM, it could slip out and spin and who knows where at super high speeds, okay? And that could be dangerous.
That'd be fun.
That would be not so fun.
It's fun. Yeah.
Yes, for the person there, it would not be fun, but it would be, yeah, scary. But, so, make sure you remember that 15 millimeters. So, but instead of actually measuring 15 millimeters, what you can do is, if I just put this in all the way, don't just tighten it as is right now, because if you were to look closely, it kind of has a bit of a round over at the bottom. And the way the collet works on the router table is it actually sucks it in a little bit when it tightens. So if I have it right at the bottom, bottomed out, is it going to be able to pull in more? No. So what you need to do is you want to push it down to the bottom, lift it up maybe like 1/8 of an inch or so, so it has a bit of clearance, so when it pulls down, it's not going to bottom out on it, and then you're going to tighten it, okay? So we'll do that, so we'll lift it up a bit, put the wrenches in there, and we'll tighten this guy back up. Stop, check. Yeah, we got nothing in there. Alright, now whenever you're tightening tools, you don't have to refit super hard as tight as you can, because then if you have to loosen it, it's going to be really hard to loosen. So just you want to get it nice and snug so that it's not going to go anywhere, and then it's good to go. Okay, so then when you're done with the tools, put those back in here, and then what I want to do is I want to take this and I want to lower it back down. Now this router bit is a round over bit, so this is actually the one you're going to use on your stools if you want to do the rounded over profile on all your pieces. Okay, so I will need to make sure this is set up properly first, so what I'll need to do is lower it down just so the curved part is flush with the table, okay? And I'll usually do it with a test piece of scrap to make sure it's where it's supposed to be, okay? And then once it's where it's supposed to be, you can lock it in place so then it doesn't wander up and down on us. And then depending on what you're doing with the router, if I'm doing pieces that are just square and flat, then what you're going to want to use is this fence, okay? So for those of you who can see, does it say anything on this fence?
Feed.
It says feed. What else?
And then
Has an arrow this way. What does that say right there?
I think.
It says face side down. So whatever side you're trying to do, so if I want to round over this side, that side needs to be down, okay? And if I take my piece of wood, so let me just adjust the fence on this. So the fence, I want to have the fence so that it just barely rubs up against this bearing, so that when it goes through, it just barely touches it. And then let me take my clamp. Actually, can I get someone to come over here for a second? Natalia, you can be my nice volunteer. Okay. So I'm going to get you to take this clamp.
So I take your glasses from the table.
Okay. So when I get this set up, I want you to clamp this to the table. Okay. So I want you to take the clamp to the table. That's it. There you go. There. Thanks. All right. So then, when I'm using this, I want to make sure my fingers are well away from the blade, okay? So, does anyone know what a hitchhiker is? What does a hitchhiker do? Sticks their thumb out, like this, okay? So, when we're using this, I don't want to have my fingers dangling like this towards the project. I want to tuck them in and have my thumbs out, okay? So, if I'm doing something like this, I want to tuck my fingers in like this and try to keep my fingers away, because if I'm reaching over like this, am I getting close to the blade?
Very.
Very. Okay, so I want to tuck them in. Now, also, what you can do is if you don't want to get close, you can actually use push sticks as well. Okay, so the same push sticks that we use on the table saws, you can also use it here on the router table. Okay, so like I could push this against the fence and then I could push it through like that if I really need to keep my fingers away. Okay guys? Now, the reason why I feed this way is because I need to go against the rotation of the bit. Okay, so the way the bit spins, I want to go against the rotation, because if I go with the rotation, that's called a climb cut. And if it goes with the rotation, it could go like this and shoot off the table. Okay? And then my hands could slip towards the blade, and that could be scary. So you need to make sure you always go with the direction of your cut. Now, when you're doing your cut on this, there's a couple things you need to keep in mind. Okay? Don't go too fast. Okay? Because if you try to go too fast on this, it's going to potentially tear and rip your project, which won't be nice, and you're going to have to do some sanding. And the other thing you need to be careful of is don't go too slow. Because if you go too slow, what happens when you take two things and rub them together? Friction. Friction creates heat, and heat leads to fire or burning. Okay? So if you were to hold this in one spot and let it sit there, that friction is going to heat up, and it's going to potentially leave burn marks on your project. Okay? So sometimes it's unavoidable. So a lot of times I've noticed, so this is the straight grain of my board. This is the end grain. I tend to find that on end grain, especially with hardwood, so like this is red oak, and you'll notice like this side here looks pretty clean, and these sides here look a little black. That's because the end grain I find tends to burn a little bit more than the straight grain. So sometimes that's unavoidable and it's just gonna happen. So for those of you making red oak stools, that's something you might have to deal with. Now, I didn't do it, but you're gonna probably wanna sand those black marks off, okay? Because we don't wanna have those little imperfections on it, okay? So then I would take this and I would feed it from right to left at a nice easy pace and make my cut, okay? Now, another thing that we can be mindful of is if I take my board, something you'll want to remember is, hey guys, the fibers in the wood run in this direction with the grain. So on the end, like if I was to do the end grain here, as the router goes at the end, there's a slim chance it could tear the wood at the end. So sometimes I find what's nice is if I'm going to do the straight grain, it's usually a pretty easy cut. But if I want to do the end grain, I find what helps is if I take a piece of scrap, put it at the end of my cut, it's going to create support so the fibers don't just blow out. Remember on the drill press when we didn't have a backing board, what happened? It like exploded in the back. So kind of similar with this, if I don't give it support on the end grain, those end grain fibers will just stay there instead of not just like blowing out like that, okay? So, is there any questions about this? Fine. Now, can you take a nap? Now, this is a table router, okay? There are also hand routers. So, if you were to look under this table, it's essentially just a hand router fixed to a table base, okay? So, if I was using a hand router, I would have some project clamped to a table. You never want to not clamp your projects. And I would always have two hands on it, and I could do the same thing on here with a hand router. But if I'm doing something super big, like say the workbenches, say if I wanted to router the edges of the workbenches, are the workbenches pretty heavy? Yeah. So if you have something super heavy, I can't really clamp down a workbench, so it doesn't need clamps. But for something small, like the things you're gonna do, you either need to have a table router like this or have it fixed to a table if you're using a hand router. And same thing, if you're ever using a hand router and you need adjustments, always unplug it. Make sure the on button can never get bumped, because if it's sitting with the blade on the table and you turn it on, it's like how many of you have ever had a vacuum turn on accidentally at home when you're cleaning because it was plugged in? Does it startle you? Yeah. It's horrifying. Now, same thing with the router, except it's going to dance around the table and like attack somebody. It could be dangerous. Okay. So with the hand router, whenever you're done with the hand router, you always want to turn it on its side so that when it's turned off or turning off, it's not touching anything. And same thing with this. When I'm using a project, depending on what I'm routering, I always want to like finish my cut, or say there's a hole in here and I finish my cut and there's a hole, I want to move it off the bit and then turn it off so it's not touching anything. Okay? Now, any questions? All right, let's turn the power on, so I'm going to show you what this looks like. Okay, so can someone hit the green button on the gray box over there? So remember, I'm just doing a quick cut so you guys don't need hearing protection, but I'm going to wear hearing protection. Okay? So with this, make sure they fit nice and snug. Make sure it's plugged back in. Make sure your fingers are tucked in away from the blade. And then the on button's here. So if I pull it out, it turns on, see how it spins super fast? Push this to turn it off. So we're gonna make our cut. Right? So cut the fingers in. So it's a nice easy pace. And if you look at the board, like you can even like feel it. See how it's kind of got one side's a little rounder? Okay. So then, depending, I probably should have this bit adjusted just a little bit. And then I'll do the same thing on the end grain. So I'm going to just support it with this extra little piece. And then sometimes, I notice students don't always put enough pressure on it because it always has to be touching that bearing. If you ever find there's weird lumps and bumps, it means you pulled off at some point. So you might just have to run it through again and just make sure it's good to go. Okay? So that's how you use the rub. Any questions about the rub? We're good. All right, so let's